All right, everybody. So today we were going to just follow up on our discussion about refactoring plans. Let me pull up that on Teams. Teams window. Oh, okay, I zoomed in. That's why. It's like that's oddly large. Okay. So the scope is broad here. I mean, I guess our basic goal is to get to a consensus on different kinds of refactoring that might happen while we're doing other improvements in the code. So this is what we left off. We had talked about feels like this is a lot longer than we had before. Is this right?
That was what we were editing, so.
Okay.
Seeing
I'm
Lily's
just making sure this is the
is-
right place where we left off. Were there other notes added, or is this just basically where we left off? And I'm forgetting because it was linear. Either way, it doesn't matter, I guess. I think this is where we had kind of jumped to. I think we kind of finished discussing this, and I think where we left off was we're going to rename the Weaver to be Weaver in the repository after the bootcamp. I think we decided we're not going to change the breakdown of the YAML file, but something we could obviously talk about is the structure and order of different sections in that file. Does anybody, as I'm looking at this now, live with you all, I'm actually trying to think about what are things we needed to discuss more during this time, but I know that there were those things. So if anyone else can think about what we need to talk about more, let me know.
It might be useful to, I don't know, something, I don't remember who I was talking to at what point, but about mapping out the relationships, like what we want the relationships to look like between the various classes and objects. We could possibly talk about that change to the kind of long if statement that's filtering blocks and making classes for those blocks, like the draft PR in there or something like that.
Can you explain what you mean by the relationship between, I'm not sure quite what you meant by that. We're talking about the relationship to different classes.
So
what?
Somewhat the relationship between different classes, like where different things are happening in the question class versus, or the questionless class versus the fields themselves, like where responsibility is lying for which pieces of functionality, kind of what does the YAML do and what should the YAML do that it should be responsible for versus what should the classes be responsible for.
Okay.
And kind of how the flow works back and forth between those, right?
Okay. Yeah, and I think we could break that down further. The field. And I think we could probably say like, I think do we already have a question here? Oh, here we go. This is probably one we didn't really discuss. On Monday, I don't think we really got to talk about that. So that's another place where we could discuss. I think that's a good idea to start with the class because there's a bunch of little sections there that are inside that big if statement. And once we know what those should look like, anyone could just power through and make little small subclasses for each of those. So let's take a look at that. Big class.
And for example, do we want like to
Hold on,
separate
I
out
can't
like,
navigate while you talk, so just hold on a second.
sure,
All right, let me just pull that up, and then I want to jump to what you're about to say.
sure.
Okay, so let's take a look at that if statement first. Okay, so everything, as we know, everything here is handled in this giant if statement. Almost everything becomes a DA question, and then it invokes the source method of the DA question. So I think the basic outline that we would want to move to is to have a class for just generic question is going to be this. And if we get down to the next self, if type equals signature, signature would be a subclass of DA question, and the source method of it would output this text. The main thing there would be when you create the object in the YAML file, you would explicitly say I'm making a signature type object rather than I'm making a DA question type object, and saying the type is signature.
So one thing was, I was wondering if we could change the nomenclature to have DA block, because we're not making, they're not all question blocks. They're actually blocks, and some of them are code blocks and some of them are question blocks. Another thing just to note, and this may be my own lack of familiarity with Python and how its built-in stuff works, but I tried to use source and it ended up like, maybe I don't know how like subclassing works. I tried to use source and to override the parent source with a new, I ended up resorting to string because I couldn't make it work any other way.
Yeah,
So
I think that
I
was
don't know if
probably
there's,
it was probably like a really specific issue that you ran into there. Let's see
okay.
if we can figure out. Let me open up yet another tab with that. And go to your branch there. Do you want to take a note of what you just, the first thing you said, because now I don't even remember what it was.
Sure.
Put it in the text underneath our.
First thing I said just now about question block just being block.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, trying to find the file. What? Maybe you.
It's an open pull request. It's like in draft mode, but it is.
Oh, you're right. I could just go to the pull request. Yeah, I went to the branch, but right.
Yeah, the bottom one. Yeah.
All right. I don't know if this will definitely help us figure out what you tried and didn't work, because obviously that won't be in the code. But what are you doing here? So
I left it there. I was too frustrated. I was just like, it's just going to be a demo anyway, so it should just be in there. I'm trying to find the, okay, there we go.
So we wouldn't have like this, basically you made it a string method. Were you creating it at the top level, or were you always doing it inside the if statement still?
That's not where the trouble was. That's what I resorted to.
Okay.
But I tried to make it source and then do a source, dot source on the object, and it did not work. I think it just kept using the parent class's source method instead of the one that I had created for the class.
Okay. What we could try doing is coming up with one small model. And it is possible to override a parent method that's in a subclass.
Okay.
So yeah, I
So
think
that should,
I don't know where
okay.
there was something slightly wrong. I don't know what it was, but I think we could probably come up with a
Yeah.
model and then they'll all work the same way. So we'd be able to copy from there once we get it
Okay.
working in one. It's not an inherent limit of subclasses. It's the point of a subclass. So
I also remember struggling with how to add a not DA question to the list of questions.
okay.
And I don't,
that
and I
is a
don't, and
some specific thing. And yeah, so you
So-
can specify the type of an item when you add it, but by default, it will, when you, let's see the example. Let's see one example where we add it. Hold on, let's see. So the thing about changing question to block is you can see how many places we reference it in the code.
Mhm.
So that definitely changes the scope to be much larger. Doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. I think it is worth thinking about names and keeping them consistent. But, oh, right, it's like append object. One of these is going to be for a question, interview.blocks.append object.
I think those are questions.
But it's going to be the same pattern. So when you call append object without any parameters, it will create an object of the whatever you set the type in the list to be. So, and that is the interview.
It's type DA question.
Yeah, so a DA question list. And that is going to be the object type that we set as a parameter when we initialize.
No,
Yeah.
I understand that. I was just trying to figure out how to add non-DA questions to the.
So when you call that append object method with a parameter, then I think the parameter is just the type. So let me just double check that. This is of a DA list. See, so that's the style here. There is, you just put the class name inside the, as
Oh,
a,
not as a string. Okay.
not as a string, yeah. So you actually, a class is a first, a class definition is a first class object. Just, yeah, it's a little confusing when you say it that way. We were trying to kind of explain the idea of functions as first class objects in class the other day, and it did not work very well. I don't think even the CS major didn't quite get that. So I won't try to go too deep there. But that's the key.
Okay.
And if we know that it's going to always be varying types, then we could not set that object type method. We could always say you have to say what type it is. I don't think that will end up being that helpful. I think it's fine for us to do it this way.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm really interested to see what the inner state was of your objects. Like I'm wondering, when you said it was using the parent method, maybe you just weren't creating the object of the type that you thought you were.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
I really struggle to get, every time I build a class in Python, it's just not, it is not
An
working in my
abstract
brain.
thing.
Well, I mean,
it's
I've
really
done JavaScript classes before, but like the way that the order in which you have to inherit, and yeah, I don't know. And I'm not exactly sure what, anyway, so.
Yeah, every language handles classes just a bit differently. I'm still trying to get the nuances of Python stuff because I'm too used to C++ still, but
yeah, well, and there's some weird doc assemble things, like the fact that you have bare attribute lists and you don't predefine those. Like that's maybe the difference you're talking about, but it is it's a big one to me. I think that took me a while to wrap my head around. Meaning, like, you don't say in the class definition what attributes the thing has. at all. That's not part of Python.
Which I
It's
was that
allowed with-
I did come across that. I was trying to think of how to, if there
Yeah,
are
'cause
ways to do that, because could you just
be nice
name
to-
them separately and then sort of combine them when you pass them to the super object, or?
I think that with Python 3.6 and the way that it does type hinting, I think that also could give us a way to handle predefining those attributes without, because when you say the type of a variable, just like you initialize it in C++, you don't have to give it a value. So you can do that in Python 3.6 and above.
Okay.
And I think that will make it considered null for docassemble. So it will still trigger the attribute error. And but you still get to say both what variable names it has, or attribute names it has rather, and the types. That's where I was thinking would be the way to go. I haven't tried it, but I think that should work.
Do you all have a link to a model of what that looks like? Or maybe we can
Let's see, Python.
dig one up later. Yeah, I've been noticing all the hints being added. When you started adding those, Bryce, I was like, what is this magics?
I started adding them because Quinn started adding them, and I was like,
Oh, yeah?
I've never figured out Python typing because I've only used 2.7, but
Yeah,
I do
Yeah.
like
And the
it. I
person
like
who
it so much. It's so
inspired me to do it is Kendall. So projects that we worked on together. So I was like, yeah, that actually is a lot
Nice.
better. It'll help with linting and stuff. So here, oh, do you
Well,
need
the thing
that?
is, yeah, you still have to say it where they're assigned. And from what I can tell, like they're not assigned anywhere in the class that we are doing. They're assigned in like DA object or whatever is getting all of the like star args.
Yeah.
Wait, so I'm not quite sure if I caught that. Sorry, because I was reading at the same time. But
Oh, sorry.
yeah, like you would do it above the definition of the init method, right? Like it would be above here. That's where you define class attributes. You don't have any examples of that because it's not really a style you do in docassemble.
Oh.
Oh, okay. That's actually another thing I didn't know that you could just do. Okay.
And you,
So
I
just
was
an
thinking that you
equals or
could
colon?
leave off the equals none. I'm not positive about that.
What is?
I thought there was a way to say that it was of a type without defining it, giving it a value, but I could be wrong. Anyway, I didn't actually try that, so it was just a thought of maybe a place where we could do it. I think what the keyword I would even look for.
Oh, is it
On type
class?
int without providing.
Maybe uninstantiated.
Yeah, could be.
Oh, I think it was later on in that.
That was in that file I was looking at.
It was, yeah, it was in the PEP that you were looking at. At least I assume that's it's in class and instance variable annotations. At least that's I think what you're looking for.
Let me
Annotation.
see.
Sorry, it's
Is it
I
different?
just sent no, it's that
Oh,
same
you
page.
did.
I just sent the link. It's just like a later on content.
You put that on Teams or?
Sorry.
Oh, you put it in the chat. Okay, no, I see it now. It's actually easier because whenever I close a tab in Teams,
Yeah.
it's really annoying to get back to it. All right, let me grab that link.
Is that what you're talking about?
So here is, yeah, here we go. Yeah,
Okay.
see, there's no initial value. So I think that will work.
Wait,
And-
can you just pause here? Sorry.
Yeah.
That will let us list the attributes in the class definition, I think. I mean, so originally docassemble was 2.7 version Python, and then it was stuck on 3.5 forever.
Mhm.
So it's really just really new where you could start using type hints. And I think this is a 3.6 change.
Mhm. It might
Equals.
say at the bottom.
Okay. I'm good.
Yeah, and I don't quite like the way that you have to import. I mean, the typing is not as good as it should be yet, but
Yeah, the import stuff. I thought I saw a few when I was first doing this. I thought I saw a few things that were like, oh, it's fixed in 3.9 or something, of like having to import dict and like list and stuff to actually use them as types, and you could just use like under or lowercase list, but I don't remember enough of the details of
Okay.
that.
Does init in docassemble work the same way as under the regular class init? Because in docassemble it doesn't have the underscores, and I just want to know if I can just look up regular Python documentation to find out how to use the docassemble init function.
It is completely different from what I
Method.
understand.
Oh, well, it's its own name, but it works the same basic way, I thought. But yeah, maybe you can explain what you found if you looked at it.
Well, yeah, you probably know more than me. All I know is at least the extent I could find the docassemble documentation is just like, don't mix up like the Python underscore init with docassembles no underscores in it, because they're like just different function calls and one won't happen. But they didn't, at least you didn't give any like what's when the non-underscored init is actually called. I know the underscored init is called like when the object is created every time, but I have no idea when the not one is called and how docassemble uses it.
I mean, it definitely does get run when you initiate an instance of the object, but I think the only reason why Jonathan changed it is to keep the name simpler. I think it otherwise works the same, but I don't know for sure. There are some things like that, like adding a dot number method of a list instead of just telling people about len. There's some places where you just rename things thinking like it would make it a little bit easier.
I see.
So
can I use a regular class instantiation like this definition in docassemble? Can I use like if I don't subclass from a docassemble object of some kind, docassemble class, can I just use underscore in it, or does everything need to have that custom in it?
It depends on what you want to do with it. So if you are using it to use inside a function or another class, and it never gets exposed to being a value that gets defined in a docassemble question, sure. But if you're trying to give it values inside docassemble, you want it to be able to treat attribute error, name error, use the dot using method, basically like it just gives you a lot of convenience features for working with it as a docassemble variable.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So it's kind of a different. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, this may have been a bit of a.
Sorry. Yeah, this is not.
It was definitely useful though. I feel like now that I know this, I'm going to write this everywhere.
The hinting part?
Yeah.
No, I want to go back in and do that too, because it's so confusing to have a class definition which doesn't define anything about what the class is unless you use the doc string, which is fine, but it's like really weird to have to do it that way because there's no standard for what goes in the doc string. Okay. So I think we've talked about how to do it in detail. Does that basic idea for what it will be sound right to everybody for what we want to move it to?
I think so. I think it would be useful to have a list of what we want to separate stuff in. So one of my questions with that PR was like, are we going down to the level of this is the main order block, or are we just going, this is a question block, this is a revisit block, this is, like,
good question. Yeah, let's take a look at what your main order block does. So
I felt that it got a little too
opinionated
into the weeds. Like it was just like, it's just this particular, like I could hand in a bunch of strings alternatively and that could be sufficient, right? Like, does it need to be its own class? But I don't know, maybe that would be useful in other ways.
I think let's start with, so what I did there are a bunch of code blocks in the interview, right? So this is a kind of code block that you're talking about here. And I think I kind of tend to think that we could build the code blocks in the YAML, but that's a big fuzzy border, right? It's like, what is something where we think it's fundamental to using the Weaver, and where is it something that like it's an implementation detail that the YAML controls?
Sometimes I think the strings are very like implementation details. Like if I think of someone forking it, I think they won't necessarily want AL intro. So should we lose the main order block and have it be a code block? And, because that's a lot of what the main order block defines as those specific strings is what it contains. And so if we want those to be more like, these are modular and customizable, then I don't know if we want to get as specific as a main order block. And that was another question I had. Did we want those kinds of strings to be in the YAML file or in the module? In the past, like what I thought I'd understood was that kind of we wanted to contain things in the module as much as possible. And I wasn't, and that people, if they wanted to customize, they could fork and customize the module and it would all be there. So kind of that was also a question in my mind about the separation of those
bullet
jobs.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it is kind of this, what should the YAML do and what should the classes do? So maybe I'll put it underneath that actually.
And this idea between, the YAML containing data.
Hold on, when I'm typing, it's really hard if you add another unrelated point. Sorry.
Sure. Of course.
Oh my God, that's what I was going to write down. Specific should. I guess it's really where would customization. I think that the answer is so the Weaver, I mean, I wrote the first draft of it, which was a very quick and dirty fork from Jonathan's in the playground wizard, which he wrote as one of the first things he did in DocAssemble, and the coding style was not consistent with later DocAssemble code he wrote. And I was trying to write it quick enough for people to start using it.
Yeah.
So I don't think there were really design decisions made at the beginning. I think that you probably observed there was a lot of stuff happening in the module, but
Yeah.
I tend to agree that the YAML would be easier to customize. I just don't know if there's another layer of abstraction we can put in between the two so that people can keep the customizations they can read the Weaver YAML file and understand it without having all the implementation details in their face. And the module file itself is relatively stock. Like where if someone wanted to do the same basic thing we did, they wouldn't have to dig around 100 lines in the code to change the things like you just mentioned, like changing it, like they're not using the vocabulary AL intro, but they want to generate a interview based on a template.
I mean,
kind of like we want to do, but with a lot of changes. Like, go ahead.
I could see, the YAML having like blocks specifically, like this is the defining the main order block, right? And it has this is the name of the intro screen, this is the name of the blah, blah, and so on and so forth. Or containing that data elsewhere about the interview in general. And then using it in the order, in the main order kind of data block in the YAML, and then using that data and that data plus the class to create a code block that is the main order code block. Like that makes sense to me as a separation of concerns. So
I'm not sure if you quite followed. Can you? So what is it? Is it responsive to this part? Then I can ask a more focused question about separating the customizations in a different place in the module or the YAML file.
I guess, yeah, I'm not seeing a layer going between them. I think if we just rethink the relationship between them, that might be enough. I mean,
can you be like a little more specific? About what?
Like if the YAML file is basically the customization of the module, right? But there might be, we could have another YAML file that's just like a data file. And then there's more than customization in this YAML file. There's functionality as well. But
Yeah, so I think Bryce is showing us something which that made me think of too. So is it basically you're
Sorry,
saying
this
you could
was,
use
yeah, like you had
Python
mentioned,
templates?
yeah, you had mentioned a bit about like just templatize, like being able to turn a lot of the stuff into the template. And like this was, like I was vaguely had that idea when I was trying to do the revisit and the table page stuff. The table page was a little bit more difficult because you have, which is just like a few lines down, because you then have to like generate all of the columns in like a bunch of different rows and then like all of the settable lists. And that's like more than just like, oh, substitute one string here.
Great.
But I think the idea still holds, and I guess I'm still kind of trying to understand the Docker simple idioms of things. But I feel like it makes sense of what Michelle was talking about. If those move into a YAML file, like sort of in the same way that we had like at the Teaching Tuesday yesterday, we were looking at like the generic object and template stuff for the labels for like first name, last name, or middle name, last name parts for the string. We could just do a similar thing for that. And it's like, except it's a generic object of the like Weaver object. And it's just like, we make it sort of document through good names and just like actual documentation that like, hey, this is what your like revisit block will look like. This is what your table block will look like, etc. And that's still on YAML and easily configurable, but the actual logic is in the Python code in the module where it belongs and is, in my opinion, at least a little easier to follow. But
yeah,
I think that's a good idea. So let me see. And this here is inside the module file, right? So are you thinking this would go, this could be an YAML file, but it would basically be, what would be the way to get from that, from one to the other, I guess?
so what it would be is like, instead of like setting this to content, we would just call like self dot, I guess like revisit template or something. And then in the YAML file, we can
Okay.
follow like, what is it, like generic object, like parent collection template x dot revisit template, and then that's the actual content in there.
and if we can be really clear about what is required versus what is optional and what is like handled, I think that could be really an easier interface. Yeah.
I'm not sure about the required versus not required part. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I'm a bit confused.
Like, for example, the main order block would need to have, like if people were customizing it, it would basically need to have some kind of, this is where you call the interview order block value, right? Like that would be a requirement for it, as opposed to other things they could decide to leave out X, Y, or Z that are more, optional. Like if they didn't want to have a line for data collection or whatever it is we're going to put there, then that would be optional. So they wouldn't have to add that in if they didn't want to. And then, but the interview order block trigger would be a required element.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're saying is like, if someone wants to customize the Weaver generated code and we want to keep the YAML file neater and cleaner, and we want to have the module be not a bunch of really opinionated stuff, we would keep the flow and logical structure of the YAML, but the actual specific details, like adding a bunch of hard-coded strings, would be in a template. And if you didn't want to include a block at all, you could just not call that line in our main order block, which now it's confusing because, hold on, let's see the full thing. Because there are this is like add short title, add form type. Like if you didn't want a whole block, you would just not mention that trigger here. This would still show the order of the blocks that you include. And we
Yeah.
might add some logic that says, hey, do you want to have a main order block? Do you not? Those could be turned into if statements, obviously, but still be in this interview order block. And if you want to customize a block, you would edit those little templates that Bryce is talking about. I think that's,
Yeah.
I do like that, because then we could have another YAML file, which is like, here is my customization. The thing there is you still have to fork. And I do like the idea of people being able to load in a template from a static file that's in another package. You can't do that dynamically in
You
DocSend.
don't. Wait. You wouldn't have to fork. So essentially, if we can get it so you're not touching the module files, you don't have to fork, right? You can just like depend on this package, write your own YAML files, and then just as long as you're doing it later, you'll override whatever YAML files we're using in assembly line.yaml or like this template.yaml that we're using.
That's a good point.
Am I just losing some?
No,
I feel
no.
like I might be, but
Forking
That's what I
was
was
the wrong word. You're right. You would have to include our Weaver and include later the things you want to override.
that's fair.
We could also
So are we
make it,
mostly just? Oh, sorry. Go on, Michelle.
if the YAML file with the templates, the data, right? They could mostly be data that we use in templates. If it was data, then people could hand in their own file with data that we could use instead. Like we could just get their data instead of our own data.
Yeah, and that's basically that's the alternative, right? So if we think of it as just pure data and not having to be compiled by docassemble, it could be a runtime thing. Then we could maybe, like this idea that I was having before, is you scan what packages are installed on the server, you pull in, you let the person say, I want to get the data from this file or this file.
But I don't,
it wouldn't be able to be a lazy template block, I think.
if
I tried to
people
create
are,
one in code and it didn't work. But there might be a way around that.
if people are, I somewhat don't understand the use case. I thought Bryce was talking about a situation where people would be installing the wizard package so that they can reuse it in their own interview. And I thought what you were describing was people coming to the Weaver and uploading a file of data that they want to use that would replace ours as they were using it on our server. I think if they're going to use it on their own server, Bryce's fits more in line with working within docassemble and how.
Well, what I'm thinking is, it's an interesting point. Once you start talking about installing a package, it does beg the question of, well, why can't the customization to the Weaver happen in that package? And they run that. It would work. I guess if we did think about people uploading data or making runtime choices about data, there's a big question like, well, what choices do they need to make? If we're really thinking about changing the court list of courts and other like really specific things, we may not care as much about having a customization of these blocks that are trickier to do that way. Like if it's all in the interface, it doesn't really matter. If it's all in the YAML file, then it does.
Could we just use start by having a YAML file that is the data, and we can use that as our default data unless someone hands something in. So we kind of start with the MVP of, what Bryce described. And then as we develop, we can allow people to customize the data that is,
well, there's
like
a distinction there
dynamically,
between
right?
data and the thing that gets compiled, right? Which is arbitrary, but it's important to clarify here, because if it is inside the YAML file that gets included in a docassemble statement, it's not a runtime thing. You can't change it at runtime. You can't let people upload their own data at that point while they've already the Weaver.
But can't you overwrite override the variables that are created? Because like a YAML list is just a list, or a YAML object is just an object. So you have the object, and then you can replace it with another object if someone presents that.
If our goal is to have like a dynamically changeable set of information, then we, I think, should have to consider that in the pattern we start with, because we'd be throwing away that little DA lazy template block, right? So if our goal is to let people change it at runtime, open question if that needs to be our goal, it might not need to be, then we just should have the right, we should start out with the design that lets us do that, because we're gonna have to, we wouldn't benefit from having it started as a lazy template block if we aren't using it that way.
Well, the way I look at it is this. People start with a Weaver. They get this generated interview, and then they go to their own playground. Now, at this point, they have two choices. Either they will continue with the path we hope they will going, which means that they will use the assembly line package, or they want to, I mean, from the whole feature, everything. But if for some reason they decided they don't want to use a lot of features that the assembly line is providing, they want to override what has been generated in the interview. They override a lot of stuff, so that now they start to use the Docker symbol to generate their own package. So there are two paths for people to take. Now, what is our goal? Do we want to steer people to go to the first path, or do we want to give them the flexibility to take the second path if they need to? I think that will actually help us go back to design how the Weaver works. Because if we don't think the flexibility is that important, then we want to basically steer people to use assembly line all the way.
Well, I could think of,
otherwise we will have to give them more flexibility. In that case, then there's more consideration that we have to give as to what to put into the YAML file and what to put into the PY file. For example, I was thinking, well, when you were talking about like main order or versus the interview order, I was thinking, okay, if there are certain things we don't want people to modify, we cannot put into the generated YAML file. We can just hide it behind, or we can put into the assembly line side. So when it's needed, we call it from there instead of going into each individual interview to call it. That way, the generated interview will look much cleaner, and people don't have to bother with it because they're not going to customize it anyway.
yeah, I mean, I think that is like the big decision point. So, I mean, I think I just like to kind of sum this up, because I think we might not all be talking about the same thing in this conversation. So I think a big decision point is, where do we want, if people, let's say, because here's different types of customizations you want to do. You might be another state and you want to not use AL intro screen but it's still a court form. Like, you might be doing the same exact thing we're doing now with court forms online, but want to change whether you store interview snapshot. That was the thing you mentioned, Michelle. You might want to change intro screen. But you might also be Suffolk. We already have this data collection goal, right? We're like, we want to see if we can make the Weaver work better to help people basically build a survey type instrument. Where the data gets stored in a database, you want to have basically a template for what the generated YAML looks like, various blocks of that file at least. that will be completely different from version 1. So do we think that that use case needs its own Weaver front end where you go to a different link to visit it? Or do we want people to be able to choose from a menu of options that say what type of form they're building? Because that will influence whether we're trying to have these templates stored as data or using DocAssemble's built-in blocks that allow us to do it with the DA lazy template. It might not be very hard. I mean, we're not talking about very complicated templates. And the other thing is like what DA lazy template gets us mostly does not matter for this design, right? Like it doesn't need to be really dynamic. You're talking about things that are changed when the developer chose them. And we only have one path for editing stuff now. And we could have it use a depends on modifier on the code that generates the template easily. Or that's the last step anyway, really. So it doesn't really matter too much. Well, that's not true. It wouldn't be the last step. It would happen whenever one of these blocks was invoked. So like if you hit the add objects, sorry, I clicked on hot docs accidentally. I don't want you open. All right. It would happen when this ran. So we want it to get refreshed when we get to like the writing interview stage. But it's still a fixed point in time when we're refreshing it. So we don't really need all the features of a lazy template. We really just need a way to insert variables into. So that makes me think we really do want it to be data. We want to like load a template from a file, insert it into there. And if we want to keep it DocAssemble-ish, why not make them like little markdown templates instead of being lazy templates? Let me just look at that and just see what we have there, because I haven't really used those before, but. Or we could use raw blocks. Which is, again, something I haven't used a lot of. So basically with raw blocks, you can use Jinja tag or Mako tags rather inside a text file, and it will render the text file the way that you want. So I'm just thinking we would basically, you could concatenate those templates to make what you wanted. You could probably read them in as strings. I mean, it'd be nice if they could all be inside one file, obviously. But it's important that they're loaded dynamically. Let me see. I think the main thing is not making people learn another syntax. So if we can keep whatever format these little mini templates have to be Mako for how you insert variables, it would be nice.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find the raw template. It is really, there's too much information on the DocAssemble documentation page to find what you need sometimes. All right, I don't see it in here. But I think the main thing is like, could we provide the contents of a template that's going to be treated as a raw template in code in some way? And if the answer is yes, then we could load that text from a YAML file. We could even use the separate documents, like the 3 dashes specifier that's in a YAML file.
Really?
to separate the different templates, I think. Or we could do, I mean, there's a lot of options there, but I don't know. I mean, this is what I'm describing is obviously a lot more complicated. And I'm just curious if people have questions about what it is that I'm describing, if it didn't make sense, and then reactions.
I am in general a bit lost.
Okay, fair. All right.
And I don't know. I feel like I'm lost at what point I'm also lost. So I do understand like the main idea of trade-offs between like where we're yeah, I do understand the general idea of like where we're trying to like load the data and at what point we want things to be customizable, and the idea of just making it like loading from some arbitrary file instead of having it in a YAML that's getting precompiled or whatever.
It's better.
But at least the exact how that happens, I'm confused.
Okay. All right, that's fair.
But then what's the advantage of using this versus using Jonathan's wizard? Why would people not just use Jonathan's wizard?
Well, the advantage is that we will have predefined a couple of, I mean, like, I think we already have the court idea of what a court YAML file looks like, right? That's what we've already done. So if someone wanted to come in and customize that to make a small tweak, they wouldn't start from scratch. They would just do a few tiny things. And then we also are thinking ahead to other use cases and letting people say what type of form they're building dynamically might be helpful. And they may, like, we already are thinking about this use case as one that we're prioritizing. So we have court forms, we have data collection forms as goals on our roadmap. So that's a lot more specific type of thing we're generating than just the wizard that's built into the playground does.
So then we are not really talking about the content of the arbitrary file. We're talking about just the format of the template.
It's fair to say. I think the main thing is like, what's the entry point to the file? Like, do you start from a different link? Or do you, because then if it's a different link and we're okay with that, then using template blocks is a simple way to achieve that. If we want it to be one link, you choose the form on that type on that page, then we can no longer use the, we need a different design. We need some way to load in the data and insert the custom text into a block of pre-formatted text.
Well, from the user point of view, it's always good to have one fixed URL instead of thinking, oh, you can this or use that, and that's confusing.
That's kind of what I'm thinking, but I don't know how much overhead it adds on our side to make it flexible in that way. I mean, I think one other thing to consider is if we're talking about automation, if there are ways to automate the driving of the Weaver interview itself, then having that be in the form of data might be helpful there too.
That actually shouldn't be too difficult, I think, because I tried to combine the pre-flight with the Weaver itself, and it's really not that difficult. So this would be a similar thing, right? So you let people load up the file, and then you look at the file type, and then you direct where they go next in the code. so you don't need multiple URLs.
Yeah, I think that's true. But if we're talking about like 15 or 20 little mini templates and you want to let people choose among them, then you end up with like really complicated if statements if they're going to have different names. So it just depends on how much branching you're allowing. So that's where it's like, I think making it data might be helpful. I think this is getting a little bit boring for people, sorry.
No,
It's boring. It's just more if I feel like yeah, there's a lot of choices to make.
I'm mostly thinking, and also there are parts of the description that I don't understand, but I think they're good and interesting questions. I wonder if we want to say this particular question is one we'll revisit and and talk about other structural changes. Because for example, the stuff with the classes for different kinds of blocks, that doesn't, that progress can be made there without a complete decision elsewhere, because this is where we can just start breaking down and start breaking down the kind of monolithic if statement, and that's something that has to be done anyway. It won't be as tailored.
Yeah.
It
definitely touches on the class discussion, but I think
it does.
You could do that without, you could basically just move the code. Don't refactor it a bunch if we're thinking there's another layer of refactoring that might happen later. That might be the solution.
Another alternative, I'm just thinking of for that, to break down that DA question class is to make it, let's say, make it two classes. One is for the input, one is for the output. Like
One
the
is
question I consider as input, like a preview or review or whatever, the code block, those are the output.
I couldn't hear everything.
Yes, I have the same.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking to break down the one alternative to break down the class QA question is to make it into two classes. One deals with input from the weaver's point of view. One deals with the output. So the input I consider the questions themselves as input, but like the generated interview itself is output. For example, like the preview screen or the review screen or the code blocks, all of those. So they are like the output. That way we can reduce we can break down the QA question class.
I see the DA question class containing the data and then of the input that the user gives, and then turning that into the output. I don't see it as just a storage place for the data. It is.
Oh, no, right. Exactly. That's what I meant. It's not storage, it's generating. I mean, right now it's not a storage, right? The class is doing the generating stuff. So.
Okay. Maybe I don't understand them. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It took me a while to understand how there's like a dot question dot type or how that worked. I think I eventually my understanding is that actually when we say content equals plus equals, that's where we're generating what comes out as the generating input interview. On the screen and as well as the download. But right now the DA question is so big, and I know Bryce was thinking, well, we should break it down. So I was thinking the one way to break it down is to separating to input versus output. But I don't know if that makes sense.
I think that
Well-
I was gonna say I think that makes sense, but the issue is that the output. I think what Michelle was sort of trying to hint at was the like the input or the output is like really dependent on the input, even the stuff that doesn't seem like it might be, but like every block is like of like the code block and the review blocks and the question blocks are all like essentially directly connected to the input. And so even if you split that between two different classes, you'd still have a lot of like dependencies and sort of just, or not dependencies, but like couplings between those classes.
Yeah, but can you like can you then use the input result as an input for the output, where you pass it to the next class? Is that possible? As
Yeah,
a
but,
class or as some big object, so that you don't have to do the item back.
So I think maybe there was a part of the conversation that didn't get communicated so clear. So the way that we're thinking about breaking down the DA question block is to make them just into blocks. And so each block would handle its own kind of thing. A code block would handle the input in a different way than a question block that would handle it in a different way than a review screen block. And so I think that was the model we were looking at. If we were, from what I've seen, kind of how Bryce was saying, there's so many dependencies between the input and the output that breaking them down might just cause a kind of snarl where we keep just passing information and functionality back and forth, whereas keeping that part together so that the input and the output are like right next to each other will keep it from getting so hard to track down, because it'll be right next to it'll be right there. And so the thought is to break it up by type of block as opposed to by input and output. But I may have misunderstood your intention, and if so, sorry.
No, I think it makes sense. It makes sense. So when you are saying block, you mean like a def, like a function. So they're separate.
Well,
What do you mean by block?
oh, just like a YAML block. So like, here's a block, right? This is a code block.
Well, specifically like a YAML block in the
Yeah.
generated interview.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, this is obviously, yeah.
So there's no like
Interview section.
place in docassemble that I found that says this, but like we have blocks that are basically code blocks. They're just code and they have the code in them, and they might have a comment or something, but they're basically what I'd call a code block in docassemble. And in docassemble, there are also things that I consider question blocks, where their main purpose is the question, and they're not going to have things that are in the metadata block, and they're not going to have, right? It has certain specifiers that go together. So I think we're saying we're going to identify these similarities. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so, all right, so I think we can jump back into this discussion. So I think we've closed the loop on this. I suppose like one for now. I mean, I think someone needs to investigate this and see, does this work? Is it way more effort than the other approach? I don't know if anyone wants to try, maybe, since people didn't quite understand what I was saying, and maybe it should be me, but I'm definitely willing to have someone else investigate it.
I don't think I understood enough to, like, I'd have to see what the interface would need to look like. And then I could try to make, like, what's the starting point, what's the ending point, and then try and make it happen. But I think I just didn't understand enough about that.
Okay. So
And also
what do you Bryce?
I was gonna say, well, I maybe can look at this, but I want to make sure I understand the difference between loading data dynamically for flexibility versus for like streamlining things. Because I feel like at one point I feel like we were mostly talking about flexibility, but at one point I thought I heard us talking about like screaming or like reducing friction just like in the existing interview, and I feel like those are just
No, you're right. No, you're right. They are. I mean, I think one goal would be to make this YAML file shorter, because we do really specific stuff in, sometimes it's in the interview order block to control what fields get shown in what order. Sometimes it is in the module file, and we don't really know quite why. Some things shouldn't probably have been in the module file, but we did them there. So like we're like, let's put those all in one place together. It'll make both files easier to customize and shorter and easier to read and find what you need, because you'll just see the logic rather than the details of the implementation. So I think they're congruent, but you're right, they're different goals. Was that helpful?
Yeah.
So I guess, did that lead to like a comment? Like, is there something where you're thinking maybe the goals aren't congruent? They could conflict with each other?
I don't necessarily think so. Yeah, I don't think they would get in the way of each other. It's just more if they're just different efforts.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if there's like an easy way to say, hey, we're going to use the XYZ template, and you chose the source for that template, but it's going to be the XYZ template from that source, that feels like it won't really make things much longer.
Yeah.
Inside the interview assembly line YAML file, and we're moving out of the Weaver code. Just trying to think, like, where's the interface there between the two? That'll help us figure out if we can do these as separate tasks. If people are starting by taking the, what was I going to say from that? Okay, if we're going to try to do the breaking up the DA question class into separate subclasses, if all of here are the specific fields in this specific order, if that all happens in the YAML file, no matter how it gets done, that's a standalone task that we can do. But if that all happens inside the module file, or it references something in the module file, then it feels like it would be a bad idea to start that task before we know the way that that is going to be customized.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. Probably we need to think a little more and not make a decision at this minute.
Okay.
It's going to impact how what we're going to do next, right?
Yeah, it's hard. That's why, like, I mean, everything connects, right? So like, you want to reduce the amount of refactoring you do twice, but if you want to be iterative, that means some wasted effort. And it's like, hopefully it's a small effort that you can learn from, and maybe it would have changed your mind about the next step. So it's not wasted really at all. This feels like so small scope, actually, to figure out, can we load data and insert fields into it? It's like, basically, we're going to make our own Mako thing that uses Mako, just like DocAssembly uses Mako. It'll use the same tags, but it will be our own implementation of it. Maybe we can reuse a bunch of DA code. Maybe we have to do it from the base module. So I think we can experiment with this, figure out if it's even worth trying. But what will take longer is the hard part is going to be the architecture, right? it'll take a little while to fix in our mind. I think it probably needs to wait to see till we've done this, but I think probably this. I mean, I think that'll be this part. So maybe we don't need to actually see how this works in detail to see like what the API is, but I guess we have to decide if this is even the right way to go. So let's figure out if that is possible before we design the interface. We can decide about the scope of each class and think about that. People could start looking at that. And like, where are there similarities? Where are they different? Even if we don't know how we're going to specify the order of the text that goes into each block, right? Something that people start thinking about now independently. I think we have a basic idea of how the class is going to be set up and what it should do. We're going to try to use the source method and have things like question blocks inherit from one class and things like code blocks inherit from another. And then there are all these random metadata type blocks, objects block, and so on.
Should we have some, should we have a concept that's as flexible as a list of specifiers? Is that something to start with, or should we be very specific with each kind of block about what specifiers? We just have our defined specifiers.
I think it depends on the needs of that block, but I think starting with the generic concept and seeing if it works to help save 3 other classes be simpler makes sense to me.
Sure.
Like maybe an example of one that's harder is with the objects block, it dynamically decides if it needs to create a dot using structure, right? And that is more specific what it does. But for the metadata block and the features blocks, those are almost the same except for the name of the keys.
Okay.
There's more complicated stuff happening in them. So I think there are like 3 or 4 blocks that will be almost exactly the same that still might deserve their own name because maybe people want to have pre-coded options in their little template for some of them, right? They don't want to specify at runtime. And we'll use it for where it makes sense that way.
Okay.
Do we want to try to talk about this? And I don't quite know. It feels like maybe Bryce, Michelle, you were having some discussions about, where is it here? Basically the scope of immutability. Yeah, this is here, it is here, of the fields.
Yeah.
That are not fields, but reserved names rather. Can we just try to start that discussion in the last 15 minutes or so? And maybe I won't share my screen because maybe there's something that one of you would like to share.
I feel like I wrote my thoughts down on this somewhere, but they were essentially just the equivalent of start using them like globals again, because I feel like it's just more like, I don't know, Docker Simple is so like global centric. I feel with all of the everything in YAML's just being global all the time. But just rename them to be constants. Like I feel like we called them constants because that's like a good name and people know what they are easily, but they're really just like reserved stuff that we're always going to use. And so that
Like
was
reserved. Is it more like defaults or is it reserved? Because like it's not necessarily reserved by us, and then I think that definition gets really fuzzy, but I could see it just being reserved.
It's not like the data itself is reserved. It's just these are like the reserved words, and you can add to reserved words. It's not reserved from the, I guess, so maybe that's funny. I was gonna say it's not reserved from the sense of the like programmer writing assembly line stuff. It's reserved from the view of the weaver, like defining what variables are where. So
sure.
But that was all. That was. I think that was just the extent of my thoughts. Were just to make it clear it's not constants, and then maybe stop passing. Like, and then if we do that, stop passing in like directly. Like we have these weird keyword args for like every single function we have that are defaulting to this, but sometimes aren't. And I feel like when they don't, that would make it more difficult to like lose track of things that people are actually adding.
I think the question of like where are we using, like, allowing customizable arguments, where do we really want to allow the customization? Like what are we trying to allow customization for? Might be a good way to ask that question, and about whether they need to be passed in as keyword arguments. For the keyword arguments, I mean, then we'd have to do a whole default thing. But I also think, well, the other part of that is not really well formed in my mind, so I'm just going to leave that there. But it was about like how we are using each of those, like just to re-examine that and to like really nail down what their purpose is, and name them accordingly and clarify their use accordingly.
I haven't used it really. So can someone describe how it is currently functioning?
So one example is with users, right? So users, the Weaver knows that it's a person, it's going to have a .name, .first, whatever. It knows how to put that into the generated YAML file correctly, so that .name, so that it's gather in the interview, but it's .name in the .name.first in the review screen, and there's a question written for it and stuff. So it just knows how to handle it. It handles, so the Weaver handles reserved things in a very particular way. So user is an example of a reserved word that the Weaver knows. So is, for example, signature date.
Okay, let's pause there. So reserved, to me as a user of the Weaver, it makes no difference to me, right? Because you're doing all that behind the scene. I have no control.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Well, other than
there's
you
two
can,
things it does. Like, so one is it might transform the variable in the YAML file. If it's a PDF that you're uploading, it'll get some changes done to it, probably, if it's reserved. And the other is you might not get it to customize the question for it in the Weaver process. That might be something you have to do later if you need to customize it. So that's like why it matters that they're reserved. I mean, I think like this is really the same discussion that we had before in the other topic, which is like where and when do we want people to customize these, both during the interview course. There's only one example of that right now, which is we let people identify names that are for people using that we found with our heuristic, at least. And we allow people, but in the future, we might want people to have whole different sets of reserved keywords that get transformed in different ways.
So I suppose when you train new users, you tell them, you give them this list of reserved words, or tell them how to name their PDF fields, right? Mm-hmm. So in a large sense, that since you're doing that already, it doesn't really make a whole lot of impact for the user, for the developer, because I followed your instructions, I named my fields already, and then the Weaver does what it needs to do. And then when I go to my playground, that's a different story. But as far as the Weaver goes, that's all it does, it cares.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is the developer pain around it. I think that's where Bryce, you're coming from, right?
Yeah, this is for us, not for users.
And then the users that we might think of are mostly like other organizations who want to fork, or not fork, but use this for their own purposes, which we should remember is us sometimes. Like sometimes we want different reserved keywords for different types of forms we're generating that aren't core forms.
Yeah.
So then, in other words, if we map out how the reserved words are used in our PY file, we can streamline it there, right? It's all under our own control.
So we originally had a design where they were just globals defined in the Python module. We moved to one where they're passed as keyword parameters in each function.
Why did we move that way?
So I made that change. My thought was encapsulation, just as a general goal, that like it's hard to understand a function if it's referencing a variable that's not in the scope of the function. So I find it hard to use globals for that reason. And the other one was that it is something that I thought would help us prepare for using different sets of reserved keywords more easily.
Okay, so far so good.
I think that like it has made it easier to find. I think that just having it in a separate file has done like a lot to be like, okay, this is where I find the, so I don't think that missed its mark at all.
So then where's the problem? Where's the thing?
So I think the first of all, it's somewhat in the names, in that the names are a bit confusing and hard to hold on to. So and don't quite fit the purpose anymore, though they did at the time. So for example, calling them constants may be at this point a misnomer, and we might just want to change them to globals or reserved or something like that, so that it's a bit clearer what their use is and how they behave and are treated in the code. And then there is looking at like how we group them. Are they grouped? Maybe they are grouped just fine, but
There is some duplication there.
there is
Like-
a little duplication, and thinking
Okay,
about
so
those
it's
groupings
the
might
naming
help.
and the duplication. So that's the same thing that we talked about on Monday, where you were saying about the variables in general. So that this is included in that. Is that the case?
I'm not sure. I don't remember.
Might be similar, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I think that probably one duplication is like there's things that are just about people and things that are a larger scope, but the sets are exactly the same right now. So that's probably where that's happening. Like, but maybe in the future we'd want to reserve things that aren't people. So we still need people to get thought of separately.
And the question is, do we want to keep them separate for now, or do we want to say like we will do, I mean, do we have like a concrete plan and so we still want to keep them separate, or do we want to say this is just our list of people and that's, you know, and we're going to just keep this as a single list until we start implementing more than that, right?
Well, I just had an idea, which I think is worth saying. I don't know if
Sure.
it would help solve all the problems, but what about putting this into a class? Because then you can call this a reference. It's a really clear scope. So that solves the scoping concern that I had. You can limit the keyword parameters to ones that we think are dynamic now that maybe can be overridden, but it defaults to using the self.people variable. And you can define that in the class constructor in the interview assembly line.yaml file. You can say, if you wanted to override which .py file it pulls from, you could do it there if we're thinking about that customization need. And that might
Are
just
you
be,
saying we'd write a class that would contain each of these lists or maps or whatever we decide they are? Or are you saying that one class would contain all of these?
all of the methods that are functions right now that are called standalone, if we put them in a class, then the scope of that class could include all of these lists of things that we're calling constants.
Oh, so all the stuff that processes variable names based on, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
That's good.
I don't know. So I'm not sure like if that's fully addressing what you were talking about or not, but I just wanted to throw that out as an idea.
It's a really interesting idea.
So would that solve the duplication problem?
I mean, only if we solve the duplication problem, because there are some things that are being duplicated, so we need to unduplicate them.
It gives us the chance to, though. So
Yeah.
Well, at least put them all together in one place. Then it'll be easier to streamline and avoid the duplication. I think.
yeah,
Okay. What would the action item be on that next? Is just someone writing up that class and creating a draft we can review, or
I think so. Yeah.
do we
probably.
need to discuss that more, or?
But you still have the problem of the naming, right? You don't have names. I think that you probably want
Well,
to
if we're,
discuss first before you write into the class. Yes.
Well, it may not have to change too much about the names, because if we have it be like, here's the starting point that comes from this .py file and it's initialized in the class constructor, and it's clear like it's mutable within the class, and you don't use the constant as the name once it's imported into the class.
like, the names will be like all stuck in one place. They won't be floating around with everything using them. So I think we'll be able to have more flexibility with changing them too as we develop. So I think the names will become a smaller issue.
Does this feel like it's part of the interview class that already exists?
I don't think so. Like, there's an interview class.
There is an interview class. Yeah.
Oh, is that the
Really
thing that?
underused.
That's the thing that generates the final interview, right?
Yeah.
I will be
To me,
honest.
that-
I don't feel like that.
Exists.
Not that it doesn't exist, but more of like, I don't check it often. Oh wait, no, maybe I'm thinking of something else. I'm thinking of the create package zip function, which I feel sometimes is a class. Maybe I don't know what you're talking about the interview class.
There's a DA interview class, which we basically mostly ignore, but that
okay.
was part of the original design of the wizard that's in the playground now.
But I could see that being a good place for this kind of transformation functionality that is interview wide, that just
Mhm.
everything uses, which I think was the question. But maybe I
Right.
missed the
That's
mark.
fair, yeah. Yeah, that would
And
make
then
sense.
it would actually be useful for something, which would be crazy.
Yeah, I think
We
that's
do
actually-
use it. We just
That was
use it at the end, basically. It's like a container for storing the blocks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that works. That was actually, I'm realizing that is sort of what I did with the DA field, was sort of like underused and had like two functions. But I was like, hey, we're like modifying fields. And so I just sort of added a bunch of stuff under that umbrella that were specifically dealing with fields. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense that things that are specific under the interview, we can just add to that.
It's like things that help construct the interview.
Okay. Well, that should maybe be a design goal. And I don't know if that fully, and Bryce, I think we have to leave for this other meeting probably
Yep.
now. So I guess we probably should.
Oh,
Yeah.
gee, I didn't realize it was
We're a
that.
minute late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should take that up.
Anyway, I like, we can reserve some more time Monday to talk about it. I know these are good to pause and have these conversations frequently, I guess I shouldn't say even every once in a while, before we do a bunch of stuff. So I appreciate it, the chance. But let's think about whether, since Bryce, you and Michelle, both of you have been thinking about this, just play it out in your head and make sure it does solve the problems that you were raising. And also this future use case, which isn't written down yet, which is how do we let people change that for different types of forms, whether it's in one organization or a different organization who wants to do it. Like, does it help us get to that? And do we, or is it at least a step in that direction? If it's not, that's not necessarily a blocker. If it helps us enjoy developing this better for now, and we can fix that part later. I'm just thinking, if it influences our design, I just wanted to think about it. Okay, I'm gonna step away, and I will see you on the other call in a minute, Bryce.
Okay, yeah.
All right.
See you guys.
Later, guys.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.